Are you reluctant to express vulnerability in professional environments? Today we revisit this topic from a past episode titled Bleed to Lead. But now we look at how this applies to the topic of gender, with a special guest. This is Shadûf.
Welcome to Shadûf, the place where business, research, and entertainment make a baby in your mind. We will show you common trends you'll want to leave behind. It happens all the time. We'll always bring a fresh perspective, so you can trust the data or the data, but not the feces you've been fed. Welcome to Shadûf. It's time to stop the song and start the show.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Shadûf. I'm Weston Smith, your host, here with Dustin Harding, head of research, and fellow research scientist Lauren Silva. Today we have an exciting topic. It's a follow-up from our Bleed to Lead episode. If you haven't listened to it, go ahead and go back and listen to Bleed to Lead. This is kind of a part 2, and extra special, today we have a guest. Marie Wallace is here with us from the Women's Business Center of Utah. Marie, it's great to have you. Go ahead, let's jump right into it and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Great, thank you. And I'm very excited to be here. It's been fun already. The Women's Business Center of Utah is a statewide nonprofit, and it is meant to help women start and grow businesses, funded in part by grants from the SBA. So your federal taxpayer dollars are available to help business owners. We market to women. We have customized services for women business owners, but anyone is welcome to come. So we do serve men as well. Our mission is to help women build their confidence first, because we know sometimes women need that more than anything else. First is to build confidence, and the second is to help them create new opportunities and to experience success in business ownership. And I like to say through business ownership, because success could mean different things to different people.
Yeah.
What we provide is one-on-one business advising and training. And our training can be in the form of an in-person group training. It could be online, virtual. We have self-paced courses and webinars. That's more than we've ever done before in the last year and a half, because thanks COVID, we hate you, but it has helped us to do things we've always wanted to do.
That's awesome.
So that's
Great.
basically what our services are and why we do that. So
That's awesome. So does it ever happen that someone comes in, they had no idea that these services existed, and now suddenly they have access to this huge buffet of resources?
a lot of people haven't heard about the Women's Business Center of Utah or other resources that are available to them. And I remember one lady specifically at Dixie State College saying, "Oh man, I wished you had been here when I started my business 10 years ago." And I said, we were here 10 years ago. So we've been around since 1997 serving business owners. And we've made a great effort since about 2015 to make sure our services are available statewide through partners. So there are a lot of people who don't know, but that is one of the reasons why we launched this statewide directory.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Great. So we know, and we can share some statistics too if we would like to, but women have been at a disadvantage in business ownership forever. Like never not been at a disadvantage. And
Right.
Yeah.
a lot of that has to do with access to capital as well as access to helpful information. And there's a few others too. But for us, we really felt like if we wanted to help women business owners who we know are already at a disadvantage compared to male-owned companies, and they've been hit harder by COVID-19 than normal businesses because of the industries that women generally gravitate towards,
Okay.
the only way that we could figure to make sure that we could help support or influence our communities in good ways was to make sure you knew where to find them and which businesses were women-owned. So we put together a free directory and inviting all women-owned businesses to sign up for it. It's a free listing, free to use. It's at utahwomenowned.com. And that way we can promote it to our communities through our counties and our cities to help people know where to find those companies. And you shift your purchases by one a month, and we've made a huge difference.
That's awesome.
That's
utahwomenowned.com.
That's right.
Okay.
What a cool resource.
No. And it's this, well, I've done a lot of research, of course, to know what other directories are out there. Most of them are membership based.
Okay.
This is open and available as a public service.
Just anyone can.
Any, and I should probably clarify too, it is for businesses that are owned by one or more women and run by the owner. So it's
Awesome.
not a
Oh,
percentage,
cool.
but that means that it's woman owned somehow, but women controlled. And that's the most important part.
Well, that's awesome. We were having a little bit of a discussion right before, speaking of women-led businesses, meaning that they're the head honcho, and then we were asking ourselves, where did honcho come from?
Honcho? We're like, is it Spanish? Is it? I don't know.
Yeah, I thought it was Spanish, but we looked it up. Lauren, do you want to share with us where honcho comes from?
Yeah, well, one of the things we found was that honcho comes from Japan, actually. It was brought back in like the 1940s-ish after
It was
like
post-World War II.
Yep, post-World War II and stuff, and so it like meant boss, and so we also looked up some of the definitions, and it said that it is the person in charge, the highest ranking person in an organization, and my favorite part is the synonyms.
Oh, yeah.
The synonyms for head honcho are big man and big enchilada.
Big enchilada.
They're pretty
Or
good.
big woman.
Yeah, or big
woman, you know.
I like that tie because at least my perspective that I bring to the conversation is I work with women business owners who are the head honcho of their organizations.
Yeah.
I think
They're
it's
head
a really great tie.
That's great. Yeah, so now we're going to dive into the discussion for today, which is going to be great. It's going to be, I think we teased this in the last episode, that we're going to do a follow-up to our Bleed to Lead episode. Now, this episode is by far our most popular episode, right?
Right.
We've gotten such a response from it, and we knew from the beginnings that as we were discovering things in the course of researching these things, that this was going to go to some cool places, was to find out if this affected women in business. And so that's why we wanted Anne-Marie to join us today.
Yeah.
And we're so glad she did, to offer kind of some perspective. So first, let's do a recap, and then Anne-Marie, I want to get your perspective on kind of the struggle that we're trying to figure out here before we go into the new stuff.
Yeah. So just a quick recap. So a lot of people have been talking about vulnerable leadership and the importance of it, but we wanted to go and test it out to see if there was some real significance behind this. And so in our last episode, cue in on that episode to get more details, but the quick version is that we found that vulnerable leadership did significantly impact positively impact people's perceptions of that leader and made them want to stay with the company longer. But then the interesting thing also talk about in that episode is how if we switch the roles, there's an issue. So we like our leaders to be vulnerable, but if we are in a leadership position, we don't necessarily like our employees to be vulnerable, and we're less willing to promote them when they show vulnerability. And so it leads to this issue where, yes, we want vulnerable leaders, but we're not willing to promote vulnerable people into leadership positions.
Well, and it's almost, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost like it even affects the morale of the leader. Like if an employee is coming to them showing vulnerability, then the research showed that they are less likely to want to spend more time at that company.
They wanted to stay at the company
less.
They
didn't see themselves staying as long at the company
if there was a vulnerable employee. Which is crazy. So it really affects their mindset, right? Yep.
I just found that interesting.
Interesting cycle we got going on here.
Yeah.
And so for this next series of studies, we had some other questions. And one of those top questions, which is why we thought it'd be great to bring Anne-Marie over here, is yes, we have seen that it's important to be vulnerable as a leader, but does this work for women leaders as well as men leaders? And so that kind of brought up that was the next question we sought to address in this next study.
That's awesome. Okay, so before we do that, so Anne-Marie, from your experience as you've worked with women, is it primarily women who just come, are they struggling with businesses, or are these like women who want to start up businesses?
Oh, both. So I should probably mention, we gather a lot of information from our clients, so we can pull a lot of data, and I'm a numbers person, so I like to see, the stats about who we serve and how we serve them. And just barely over 50% are not yet in business the first time they come. That means that they're coming with an idea. I don't know what I'm doing. But that also means that the other half, the other half are already in business. And 30%, so that would be the majority of those who are already in business have been in business more than 2 years. So generally, if they are already in business, they're coming because there's maybe more than one thing, but one thing that they need help with. A lot of them might say, I'm doing well in these areas, but I see another opportunity that I don't know how to access. Or they may say, I just need a total revamp on my marketing. So there's specific reasons, those who come to us generally that are in business, and those who are not yet in business, it's like, I have no idea what I'm getting myself into.
Okay. So do you see, from your experience, have you seen this problem? Have you seen people who, maybe they've got great ideas and they're very organized and very efficient and have all these skills and all this talent, but yet they worry a lot about their vulnerabilities? Do you see that?
Absolutely. When we talk about building confidence, a lot of them are not confident. And for some reason, women, I think a little bit more, are less confident in themselves, even to begin with. And to share vulnerability in an area you aren't confident in, and maybe your employees are more so than you are, but still you are the one that launched the business, can be a challenge for a lot of women business owners. I do think that, I probably fall in line with a lot of the stats, is I appreciate a leader who is vulnerable, to a point for sure.
Right.
But there are things, and this might be outside of the research as well, but when women are perceived in an industry that are male dominated, this is outside the organization, of course, but be perceived as someone who's vulnerable may be something that they don't necessarily want anyone to see. For example, if a woman who owned a construction company comes to a construction site and first of all, they might not even think she's the owner. They may say, where's your husband, or who's the owner? And she'll say, I'm the owner. She's less likely to be vulnerable with contractors or vendors. So that's a different side of it. But I think that the whole confidence issue and showing vulnerability, women are really nervous to let that happen, even though it sounds like it's a very good thing that your employees appreciate.
That's interesting, because I hadn't thought about it, because I was just compartmentalizing it in my mind, like, oh, vulnerabilities are things that you have, and whether or not you display them to other people is your own ability or your own decision or whatever. From what you just said, I suddenly realized, like, oh, wait a second. Whether it's controllable or not, they might have like things that arise that put them in situations where their vulnerabilities are they kind of feel like they're brought more to the surface, right?
Right, and maybe not purposefully.
Yeah, exactly.
So, absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, according to this research, do you think this would be something that would be kind of, I guess, a relief to hear? Like, hey, maybe you don't need to worry so much about about feeling that, or about showing those vulnerabilities.
I think that that's true, because
right?
and again, it's about this confidence issue that really things that women worry about, they don't need to worry about,
right?
And that if women are, and I should read the research again, if the women, if it's women generally are more vulnerable or more scared to be vulnerable, but really it's something that comes, I think, more natural to women, as long as they feel like it's okay to be that way, that actually can help their businesses. But for women, they're already thinking, I don't know if I can do this, They
right.
get into business and now they've brought in an employee. You got to make sure that they feel confident in you as a person, even though maybe you're not as confident in yourself as they are in you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's perfect. So our initial studies were we didn't even bring gender into it. Mm-hmm. It was just because the same is applied across the board. Like, obviously, men aren't without their insecurities, and they feel like, oh man, my weaknesses are always on display, and I don't want to, and so I'm not properly motivated. I don't feel motivated to put myself out there to try and be a leader because of this. So it's just unfortunate when people who have these skills just don't feel like they can, right? And that's what we kind of want to change that mindset.
Yeah.
You know what? One thing I will mention is that, and in many ways, we do better when we see somebody else do it first, or oh, I can see her doing that. Maybe I could do that. As they work for organizations, because maybe many women work for a woman boss potentially. If it's in a woman-dominated industry, that's where most women end up starting their own businesses. But seeing someone else in a leadership role being vulnerable, they tend to be more vulnerable in the future. There was one time that I remember women not being vulnerable, and it was a kind of a conflict inside of me, and it makes sense with the research.
Okay.
So she's not an executive, but a pretty high up in a major corporation in Salt Lake City, downtown Salt Lake City. And I remember her telling me that I don't know if it was a boss or told her, if she decided that if she was having a bad day, that she would not let anybody know it. That was just like,
Oh.
you do not let anybody know you're having a bad day. And I've always thought, I don't want to announce that you're having a bad day and be ornery with people, but I really was kind of against that. I'm like, why would you pretend, like put on a face that you're not having a really difficult day? And sometimes I think of it as I'm super busy. I've got a lot on my plate. You know, I'm not going to be rude to anybody, but I always thought it was okay to say, I'm really slammed right now. But she would not let herself let anyone know that she was having a tough time or had a bad day. And I just thought that's not something I would want to do. I don't know. It just kind of seems like the research kind of shows that too.
It just comes across as like inauthentic a little bit.
Yeah.
Like you should be able to show how you're feeling. I mean, to an extent, you don't want to, like you said, come
Yeah.
across as ornery or being in
Yeah.
a really bad mood and taking it out on others. But
Well,
can
her
kinda help.
employees, they would never see her struggle. They would never see her vulnerability. It makes sense to me, along with what the research is showing.
And you have to think, like, what type of culture is that kind of bringing into
Like
the
you're
company?
not allowed.
Are your employees not allowed to show that vulnerability or to show weakness?
Right.
And it's something that culturally, you know, we want to avoid.
Right. So an employee might feel like if they make mistakes or something, that they're like, oh man, well,
Like hide it
my
or something?
boss doesn't make any mistakes, so I've got to keep this hushed. I've got to keep this on the down low and not show that I am faltering at all. That's interesting.
I wonder if it leads to employees also like being less willing to ask for help or like
Right.
correction and stuff like in their
Right.
job.
Yeah.
And it probably it can be limiting, I'm guessing, in like your ability to actually grow and move up within your company if you don't feel like you can ask questions and learn from it.
Right. So then, despite all of the personal morale, it essentially is taking away from the business, right?
There was a time that I was very vulnerable in a podcast of ours.
Okay.
And I worked there. It was only a few months ago. I've worked there at the time, probably almost 10 years, a long
Yeah.
time. And I was being interviewed by one of my employees, and she asked me to share one of my failures. And I said, oh, I got a doozy. For years, probably 2 or 3 years, I didn't dare speak about it because it just makes me have so much anxiety, because it was a near fail on my part, and our center could have been really impacted by it. And so I was very vulnerable. I told my story, and I still get my heart races when I think about how close of a call it was. And there were other things that I shared too. And she told me she learned a lot about me that day. And I'd worked with her for 2 years. By the 2-year mark, you think you know somebody. But I think it was helpful for me to share that with her because of that. Maybe she hadn't seen me make a mistake before. And it was really helpful to her to hear that I had done something that wasn't great. But being vulnerable, like I said, I didn't dare speak a word about it to anybody for a couple of years because I was kind of, it gives me anxiety, but also it was kind of like a little shameful. Like, I can't believe that I did that, but I definitely learned, that I'm not going to do that again ever, and there's things I can do to make it different.
Those big mistakes get me. Another thing that gets me is when it finally dawns on me that I've been making a consistent mistake over and over and over again. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Dustin,
Huh?
I'm unaware that you've made any mistakes in your life.
I'm not talking about me. I was talking about you.
Things that I've shared with you.
Well,
See, the study makes Dustin, he's kind of obsessed with this research right now because it's research about people making mistakes, and he's never made one, so he's super curious about it. And he's like, I wish I could be vulnerable. I wish I had vulnerabilities to show to people.
I wish I could relate.
That's funny.
I'm vulnerable in my lack of my ability to relate.
There you go.
Not true at all.
Okay, so, well, let's
get the study.
Let's go into our new research.
Yeah, cool. So like we kind of talked about and mentioned already, one of our next big questions was, how does gender make a difference in leadership and vulnerability? Like, what does that look like? Especially because, as we've talked about, there's almost a little bit of a stigma about women being vulnerable because there's a fine balance between people taking you seriously and people thinking you're a pushover as a leader in a business. So what we did was we ran another study looking at this. And so we had used some of the same scenarios as before, but changed a couple of things. So all the participants were assigned to some different groups. And the first way that we split them up was first by whether they read a scenario based on gender. And so both scenarios read like this. Imagine you're an employee at Hawk Management working in sales and client management. You're in a company meeting at work, and the CEO is addressing everyone regarding the lack of motivation since the pandemic. And where it differs is then it says either she says the following or he says the following.
That's the only difference between the two.
The only difference is just signaling whether or not it's a male or female leader. And so then we, as in our other studies, we looked at a non-vulnerable condition and a vulnerable condition. So that's the two groups that we put people into like before.
Okay.
And so the not vulnerable group, they read, although the pandemic has been a motivation killer for many, I found that consistently improving my body through exercise and my mind through books helped me conquer the demotivation trend. I am more motivated than I have ever been. If anyone here is struggling with motivation, invigorating your mind and body could help you turn things around. So that was the not vulnerable condition. And then the other group who was read the vulnerable scenario read this. I'll be honest, the pandemic has been a motivation killer for me. However, I recently found that consistently improving my body through exercise and my mind through books helps me conquer the demotivation trend. I am now more motivated than I have ever been. If anyone is like me and has been struggling with motivation, invigorating your mind and body could help you turn things around.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's essentially 4 groups.
Yeah, 4 groups.
Yep.
2 male, 2 female.
Yes.
And then a vulnerable and a not vulnerable. So it's like
Yeah.
you call it a 2x2, right?
A 2x2. That's what we call a 2x2. So yeah, you have a male leader being vulnerable, a male leader not being vulnerable, a female leader being vulnerable, and a female not being vulnerable.
Okay.
So those are the 4 conditions here. And so to test this out, you see, okay, does gender have a role to play in this vulnerability? And what we found is, nope, it doesn't.
Really?
Yeah. So it's cool. Like, so it didn't have a role in one of our main things that we were looking at in the last study was how long people wanted to stay there.
Okay.
And it didn't impact that. So vulnerability was good. It had this large main effect, and gender didn't really mess with that at all.
So in either gender, vulnerability is good.
Yeah.
Non-vulnerability or pompous arrogance is another way to look at it.
Yeah.
Is bad, right?
And what's cool is so in our first studies we looked at this effect that vulnerability has on people's willingness to stay at that company, but also what's underlying that? What's going on there? And we found in that first study that what was really causing that was that people felt that vulnerable leaders were more relatable.
Okay.
And then they were more likely to see them as a person. So those were like the 2 measures that kind of drove this effect. And we see the same thing here, that gender doesn't have a role to play in those things. That we still get that overall effect that vulnerable leaders are seen to be more relatable and are more likely to see you as a person. Yeah. So it's really cool.
That's awesome. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So essentially, it's just saying that, hey, for this specific effect, we don't have to worry about the gender aspect of. We just have to find ways overall to overcome this perception of this lack of willingness to show vulnerability if you're in a position like that.
Do you mind if I share an example?
Share an
I was
example.
thinking
Awesome.
about this one when you've been talking about this, and I've been working with a woman business owner in Chicago. It's not Utah, but I think it would just definitely happen here. And like you said, during COVID, things, that it's gotten really rough for a lot of business owners and almost everybody. I would say everybody's been impacted,
right.
but for business owners, the lady I was talking to, business owner, she lost her entire business overnight, and she was ready for a $2 million investment. Oh. And they emailed her, sorry, we can't help you. She was involved in technology in the childcare industry. Childcare in Chicago was completely shut down 100%. So that's why the funders withdrew. What she did was she met with her team. She brought them in and said, this is how much money is in the bank account. And she was very vulnerable with them, and that this is a scary situation. This is how much money we have in the bank.
Super
so
transparent.
what can we do? Yeah, totally transparent. and sharing her vulnerability, like, our runway only goes so far. I want to share that with all of you. But she had their help. And what was really cool was the very unexpected thing happened was one of her employees who she brought in paid a lot of money. So they're talking about high salaries in a tech company. And what he did was he said, I'd like to invest in your company. He worked for her. She shared what their situation was, and he ended up being an investor for her because he trusted her so much in her position to actually invest in the company.
That is so cool.
Oh, that is awesome.
Not everybody, but I was amazed at what her vulnerability and transparency did for her business. He would not have done that if she hadn't been that way with him.
Yeah.
With all of them.
I guess that kind of paid off, right?
A little bit.
A little bit.
Literally paid off.
Yes.
Saved the business, right? That's incredible. That's awesome.
Okay, so continuing on, we'll talk. We wanted to cover one more study in this episode.
Okay.
And this study, what we wanted to know is okay, we're vulnerable, but are there certain settings where it's better to be vulnerable? So we have these kind of what we've talked about so far are more formal settings. So this is a business meeting, a meeting in the company, or things like that. Those are more formal. But what about during lunch, during these informal settings?
Okay.
Is there what type of setting is best? And then another thing that we look at, whether or not we're talking about work-related vulnerability.
Okay.
Or
just like
just normal lifestyle type of vulnerability. So
Yeah.
so I'm being vulnerable about something that doesn't really affect my work,
right.
or I'm being vulnerable about something that does.
I've been taking saxophone lessons and I haven't been practicing great. I don't know.
Yeah. Man, you're a great leader, Weston.
Wow. It's all it takes, huh?
I can think of some really good examples for women, and this one just comes to mind because I've gone through it before, is if a business owner who's going through a divorce, because that's very personal. It can very much affect how you work, and some people I think would appreciate knowing, like, I'm having a rough time, because
Right.
it might be that you have employees who've gone through the same thing, and so being vulnerable to share something like that can really be where you connect more with your leader,
Yeah.
because they're not superhuman. And things can happen in our lives that we didn't plan on. And it could be anything like that. It could be a loss of a child. It could be, anything like that. And that's what I think about when it's non-work related,
Mental illness, you're
Exactly.
dealing with depression or whatever
Yeah.
it may be.
Yeah. So this study is really cool. It's actually the last one we talked about, Weston, you said was a 2x2.
All right.
This one, it's a 2x2x2. We just thought we'd go all crazy with this one. So what happens is in this study you have vulnerable or not, right? We also have this: is it in a formal setting or an informal setting, and also is this work-related vulnerability or not?
Okay.
So you kind of get 8 different conditions. Looking at each of those
Okay.
things. So it can be a bit overwhelming with at least analyzing a 2x2x2. So we'll break this down, but it really is really cool. So work-related vulnerability, first of all, we'll just talk about that really quick. That's the same thing that we just went through. We didn't bring gender into this. We didn't want a 2x2x2x2. That would just been like nuts.
Well, especially when we already figured out that doesn't make much difference at all.
Yeah, so we're using that same pandemic has been a motivation killer for me or not, and this is how you get over it. Okay, so that was kind of our work-related vulnerability.
Yeah, so like we said, one of the different groups that we added was whether it was non-work related. And so we got this scenario from a book by Rachel Cruz, and so we just adapted it a little bit. Yeah, so like we said, one of the new conditions we added was whether the vulnerability was work-related or not work-related. So in the non-work related condition, we had adapted a scenario from a book by Rachel Cruz. So in one scenario, as they're coming up and doing their long run, the vulnerable one is that they say, I ended up, after couple laps, I just couldn't do it. I went to my car, I quit, and it was awesome. And, like, it's okay to quit things and not follow through.
Okay.
And the not vulnerable scenario was them saying, I stuck it out on that long run. It made the difference, and I ended up, like, completing the half marathon kind of thing, or completing the full marathon.
It is okay to quit, by the way.
It is okay to quit. But so those were the two scenarios for the vulnerable, non-vulnerable in a non-work related setting.
Okay.
So they all
by
deal
running a hobby.
Yeah, so they all deal with motivation. It's either I'm dealing with motivation, the vulnerable is I'm dealing with motivation at work, or I'm dealing with motivation during this run and I quit.
Okay.
So
what were the findings?
And just really quickly, the other thing that we looked at as well was whether it was informal or formal setting. In the informal setting, they're at lunch and they just happen to be talking to the CEO, and the CEO mentions either this vulnerable or non-vulnerable moment.
Okay.
That's either work-related or not. So
it gets a little confusing, guys. Stay
so
with us.
it's either in a work meeting, like the CEO is addressing everybody, or it's in an informal setting during lunch. Okay. First of all, like when we look at these things, we look at, okay, what were the overall like big effects? Vulnerability still has an effect. Overall, it was positive. Informal settings seem to be more positive than formal settings. Okay. But when you look into this kind of this interaction, is what we call it, between these three different twos. So whether it's formal or informal not, or vulnerable or not, or work related or not, we see that although vulnerability overall is good, there's some cases when it's not so good, or some cases when it is good, or when it may not really have an effect,
where it doesn't matter.
Right. And so what we see here, let's just start informal setting. When you're at lunch, it's good to be vulnerable about things that are not work related. So for instance, Anne-Marie, you mentioned like a divorce or things like that about your life. Those informal settings are a good time to be vulnerable about those.
Ooh,
like,
I do that a lot at work,
things.
by the way. As a state director, it's always like kind of the casual conversation where I feel like I'm the most vulnerable. That's really interesting because you don't want to be vulnerable nowhere else, but that makes a lot of sense because I don't think they think less of me when I share, on non-work related during casual instance at work.
Well, and I feel like too, when I think of coworker dynamics, or like you work with these people, you want them to be your friends, and so often when you like are chatting with each other, that's when you really get to know them, right? So I think those are good opportunities, and so being vulnerability is being like, hey, I'm letting you know more of who I am, right?
Right. Now, you need to be careful with these non-work related things, because what we find is that non-work related vulnerability is actually detrimental in formal settings. Okay. During formal settings, you don't want to just be vulnerable about your life things that don't really have to do with work. So that's the one case where we see it kind of flip.
Okay.
Right?
Kind of like reading social cues and kind of reading the room, knowing what to share, when to share, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't share too much.
and then the non-surprising result that we saw is just replication of what we saw earlier. So yes, Weston, you asked, and we got the same effect. Yes, so informal settings, when you're vulnerable about work-related things, that's positive.
Okay.
Right? Informal settings, it's awesome to be vulnerable about non-work-related things. You want to avoid being vulnerable about non-work related things in those big formal settings.
Well, that would make sense because someone who's going to say this is how much money we have in the bank is very much a formal conversation. Being vulnerable in a work related situation, talking about going through something difficult would be more appropriate and helpful in a very informal conversation. That makes a lot of sense.
Hey, this is a great business meeting, you guys. I have crippling debt, and I have people banging on my door.
I declare bankruptcy.
Not how that works, Dustin.
Oh, shoot.
Okay, well that's great. This is So just really quickly, if there is anything, is there anything on the horizon when it comes to this kind of study?
We've looked at like leadership internally, but how does that work when with customers and in sales situations? You know, that could be cool.
That is a whole new ballgame, right? Yeah.
Very outward facing, especially now with like social media and stuff. Like how much do you project outward outside of just your company, instead of just the people that you're leading day to day?
There was something that happened to me, and I think this might have to do this conversation, but I remember being very low key at an event, and it wasn't mine. I'd worked for a hotel in Logan, and I was at the conference center in Davis County, and I remember I was just kind of like right now, like it's Friday afternoon and I feel good and I can just be myself right now. And the whole table I sat down at, I didn't have any coworkers, anybody from where I worked, and I was just chatting with them and we were all laughing. And I got back to my office and I had a job offer from that conversation because I was totally just vulnerable and being myself. I didn't accept it because I had my own assistant who did what they wanted me to do. So I'm like, it's not a really good fit.
I hired somebody to take care of that for me.
But it's interesting because the perception that some people have of you, if you are vulnerable, not as in vulnerable sharing something bad happening, but just being vulnerably you, because we were talking before this even started about our professional voice, versus our actual voice. And I think that's part of the vulnerability that we can have. But I still think back to that. I'm like, oh yeah, I got a job offer just because I was funny. So it's interesting about the external things that can happen as well.
Well, I've never known about my personal experiences, but to me, I would see the opposite happening for me. Like after a conversation, I'd have a job offer rescinded.
Oh, wait, actually, we didn't mean to send that to you. It was the other Weston who applied.
Anne-Marie, I wanted to ask you one more question. The first step is to talk about this. When we're looking to overcome kind of this perception of vulnerability, the first step is talking about it, which is what we're doing. Is there anything else that we can do to sort of implement to kind of combat against this?
Well, at least for our center, we educate women. That's what we do. We assist and educate. So for me, leadership is part of what we do. I mean, it's not our complete lane, but part of managing a business is being a good leader. So to me, I mean, at least from my perspective, is an implementation is to teach women about the information that you have here that shows how to be a good leader. And that is going to include, in the right situation, being vulnerable, because it will help you to further be understood by your employees, be trusted a little bit more because they recognize themselves in you a little bit, And also, I think what's really important is to actually help your employees to also feel like they can be vulnerable. Because I think you mentioned earlier that, if you're the employee, you don't dare make a mistake.
Right.
I remember there was forget what the name of the organization was, but her thing was, I think it was like 3 strikes and you're out. It wasn't 1 strike and you're out. It's like you can majorly mess up in this organization and that's okay. Of course, you don't want to do it more than like 2 times because then we know that that's a consistent problem. But
at some point, it's like,
But she lets her employees know that ahead of time, and she employs hundreds of people. That it's okay to mess up. You're going to learn from it. Of course, we want to avoid it if all possible.
Right.
But just know, being vulnerable, that it's okay to make a mistake in this organization.
Right.
I thought that was really helpful to be able to share with your employees that this is a safe space. And I think a lot of people care about, not just the impact that the organization does or the passion you have for what you do. And I'm in nonprofit, so I'm all about passion. But also feeling like you can be vulnerable, be yourself. It's okay to make a mistake. We all learn from it, and it starts from the top down. I'd love to do a training on it, actually.
And that's awesome. And because that's what we mentioned in our last podcast too. It's like, because we kind of have this negative cycle if people aren't wanting to promote employees who are showing this vulnerability. And so to me, that just seems like kind of a daunting task, but kind of a cool challenge as well. But it's something that would have to change over a longer period of time. It's not just like, hey, here's some new research. We fixed it. We fixed the problem. No, it's, you're going to have either leaders who are consciously making the switch, and then also, because it's not just leaders making the switch, but it's also leaders who are okay to then promote employees that may express vulnerability, may show more weakness or vulnerability.
The area I think of too is not just what's okay and what's not in a work situation, but also what is the culture.
Yeah.
Because our organization, we've been established since 1997, but we barely established core values. And we've always kind of felt like we had them in our hearts or in our minds, but we never actually had them out on paper.
Yeah.
And so one of them was, and we all kind of brought to the table what we felt like was important to be able to work here and be happy. And mine was family first, but not everyone has families. And it really boiled down to compassion. And so our core value is compassion. We're going to be compassionate with each other. On the first day I had a new employee, I had an enormous problem with childcare. And don't tell anybody, but I had my kids in my office while I'm trying to train a new employee. That was showing great vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I asked for her compassion on me because it's a core value we have.
But your kids weren't perfect?
Oh my gosh. It was, the circus was at the Salt Lake Chamber. Can I say that out loud? But really, for her, she saw from the first day that I was being vulnerable. I didn't cancel on her. I just needed a patience with her. But she saw that I'm just a mom that has a great job, that I love what I do, but I also have, family that's also very important to me. But creating the culture so that you feel it in the organization that not just to be vulnerable, but that's part of who we are and what we do. And also externally, for our clients, if they have a problem with their childcare and they have an appointment to meet with somebody, that's okay. Bring your kids with you. We don't always plan it that way. But when we try to be vulnerable with each other, it makes sense because we also offer that to our clients.
Sure. Yeah. So then it's like you kind of give permission. You kind of say like, hey,
because
relax,
when we
it's okay.
say, feel free to be vulnerable, or even if it's not said, the culture kind of offers it.
Right.
And it's part of what you do. And I think that really draws more people into an organization and keeps them there too. Because sometimes, we've had clients that say, I can't get anybody to interview for my company. They won't show up for the interviews. I can't keep anybody because, we have such low unemployment, even though we're just getting out of COVID-19. It's competitive out there. It's really difficult. But teaching them about creating a value proposition for employees, not just for customers, but creating a culture of vulnerability.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, on that note, that's extremely inspiring, and we'll see where this goes in the future. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this awesome episode, and thanks, Anne-Marie, for being with us.
Thank you for letting me be here.
If you want to hear more about this in the future, follow us, like, subscribe, listen to our podcast, leave us reviews, and also check out the resources available at the Women's Business Center of Utah, and remind us the website that they go to for the women.
The statewide directory
Yes.
is utahwomenowned.com.
utahwomenowned.com. Go ahead and check that out as well. Thank you again. Goodbye.
Oi, mate, how's doing and all, guys?